This is Hades, an incredible roguelike about escaping hell that took around 3 years to complete and a pretty big team of 20 people. And then there's us, a 3-person dev team trying to make a game inspired by it in just 10 days for a game jam. Like, what are we thinking? This is absolute insanity. What can we even make within 10 days? But hold on a minute, how did we even get here in the first place? The jam's theme is Last Stand, and we got tons of ideas from just hearing the theme. We could maybe make a wave shooter where you need to defend a PC from incoming viruses, or maybe a top-down roguelike where you need to defeat multiple bosses, or maybe even a game where you play as the final boss itself. These all sound incredible. However, there are several glaring issues with them. The main thing is that they're quite complicated to make, especially with our very short deadline. So, after exploring several more ideas, we decided to combine things together. So, we're going to combine the wave mechanic from the first idea, take the swordsman and roguelike elements from the second idea, and finally, make you play as a total badass final boss from the third idea. Then, we expanded the game by designing a few more mechanics around it. So, I designed a power-up system inspired by Hades. Every 5 waves, an orb will spawn, and you can choose between 3 different power-ups. Every 10 waves, you'll face off against a boss. We added several limitations to keep things within reason, since the number one thing that we need to avoid right now is scope creep, which happens when you add too many things into your game, and this makes it significantly harder to develop. By the way, before we start the development process, we decided to make a visual prototype first in Photoshop. These concepts help us plan the game's overall style, and they also show us how the gameplay is going to look like. I also made a very simple development timeline. This is mostly just a guideline. It isn't a very strict timeline since things may shift around a bit. And now we begin the development process. I started by creating the player's movement, dash, and attack systems. Then I coded the enemies, and oh my gosh, coding the enemies was harder than I thought. Originally, I just made them run straight towards the player, but every time they ended up clumping together, which makes them incredibly boring to fight. So I tried increasing their collider size and, well, they're not even reaching the player now. And at this point, I'm absolutely panicking. Do I need to implement an actual pathfinding system? Turns out there was a simpler solution. I simply slapped 4 waypoints around the player, and it's animated to grow and shrink slowly. Then it's as simple as making the enemies move towards a random waypoint or the player. When combined together, they no longer clump up since each enemy has a different target now. Then I continued to make even more enemy variations. I made purple knights that can dash diagonally to the player's position, a mage that shoots fireballs, and invisible assassins that follows an invisible trail behind the player. Then, using my wave manager, I can adjust how many enemies will spawn, what types of enemies will spawn, and how fast they can spawn. It's just a simple wave manager that I made using Unity's scriptable objects. It's a bit too complex to explain fully in this video, but basically scriptable objects store data, and this allows me to iterate on waves incredibly quickly. And also, by the way, turns out designing power-ups was a bit harder than I thought. We had to constantly tweak each power-up after every single playtest. Like sometimes the power-ups were a bit too OP, sometimes they were just a bit too weak, and sometimes they just don't work well together with the game. And some of them even got a full redesign. So it wasn't just a one and done thing at the start. It had to go through tons of changes to get to this point. Alright, enough about the power-ups, let's make our game a bit prettier. Let's talk about the art style. You're a king who got betrayed by your closest allies, and I want the game to convey this feeling of an inevitable end. So I made sure that this was reflected in everything, from the presentation, character portraits, menu design, and even the flavor text. For the character portraits, we went through several style revisions before landing on the final art style. They're heavily influenced by Hades and Hyperlight's art style again. And if you can't tell already, I'm a massive fan of both of these games. Oh yeah, by the way, I haven't even talked about the attack system. You may be wondering, okay, so what's so special about that? Well, let me tell ya, the attack system is bugged. Let me explain. So normally, melee in other games allow you to vary your attacks by cycling through animations, and I tried implementing this too within my game, but it seems like the combo timer broke. So attacks won't reset to the first state, even though the player isn't attacking. Instead of fixing it, I decided to turn it into a feature instead. So now the player cycles between 3 different attacks, and on every third attack, you'll perform a sharp lunge which increases both your attack range and attack damage. Finally, it's time to talk about playtesting. This is one of, if not the most important part of the process. So in this game, I wanted to experiment with keyboard-only controls, so you move with arrow keys, dash with space, and attack with Z. You aim your attacks by just moving in a direction, and this sounds pretty simple, right? After playtesting it with my friends, it seems like it wasn't as intuitive as I hoped it to be. The controls were simply not clear enough, so I had to change something about it. So I added an extremely simple tutorial, and the first wave will only start when the player presses all buttons. Then I also added a simple crosshair to indicate where the player is currently facing, and this helped to make the attack system significantly easier to understand. And it also helps to show how far the player can attack. These 2 additions will probably never be added if I hadn't playtested my game, so be sure to playtest often. You may encounter things that you did not expect. By the way, have you noticed something? The animations for the game, or the lack of them right now. So we were still using placeholder sprites from the visual prototype stage. It worked pretty well so far, but we had to start polishing the game a bit more since the deadline is slowly ticking closer. So we made a simple 6-frame run animation for most of the enemies in the game. And luckily, they don't have hands, so we just need to animate the legs. We only made a single orientation for them since we can just flip them later in Unity. And after implementing them in-game, the game feels a whole lot more complete now. Also, you may be wondering, okay, there's still one major element that's missing, and it's the bosses. Where are the bosses? Well, it's at the end of the deadline now, and we still haven't polished the game enough. There's still tons of bugs, tons of balancing issues, and I'm pretty sure that the bosses are not going to be finished in time. So instead of trying to cram the bosses in, I had to cut them out from the game, at least for now. I do plan to bring them back in, maybe in a future update, so stay tuned for that. Other than the bosses, it's probably smooth sailing from here on out, right? Nope! Remember that I said playtesting is important? Yeah, we constantly playtested the game and found several power-ups either need to be reworked or just scrapped entirely. An example of this was the double damage ability. This was by far the most powerful ability since it killed most enemies in a single hit. The problem was that there was no incentive to take the other abilities since it was that OP. So we decided to nerf it a tiny bit by implementing a temporary solution. So it now can't kill shielded enemies in a single hit. However, since this was a last-minute addition, we didn't have time to polish it. We forgot to add an indicator that you're dealing extra damage, so most people just thought that the double damage power-up wasn't working, so I guess lesson learned. Alright, now it's time for the jam results. We were incredibly nervous when submitting our game. What if there were bugs that we haven't discovered? What if the game's too difficult? What if it's just boring? So I went to bed incredibly anxious, and when I woke up the next day, I checked the game page nervously. And turns out, our game got tons of positive comments. Woo! So we did it. We made a game in 10 days and people seem to enjoy it. We ended up finishing 3rd overall, and other categories are within striking range of top 10, which is incredible for our first proper jam. There's still tons of things that I want to tweak about the game, so stay tuned for the next devlog, probably in another 2 months. See ya!